The forest is white, not clean white, the white of old snow, packed down by boots, streaked black with soot from cook fires that never quite go out. It is January 13th, 1945, and Staff Sergeant Darrell Powers is lying in the frozen mud outside the Belgian town of Foy, watching his own breath rise in front of his face like smoke from a dying fire. The cold here isn't just weather. It's a weapon of its own. Men's feet have swollen black inside boots that never fully dry. Rifle actions freeze solid if they're not worked every few minutes. For almost a month, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne have been fighting two enemies at once, the German army and a Belgian winter that doesn't care which uniform a man is wearing. 3 men from Easy Company are already down in the open field ahead. Nobody has seen where the shots came from. Somewhere out there, between the tree line and the rooftops of Foy, a single German rifleman is holding up an entire American advance, and nobody can find him. Officers have raised binoculars to the same stretch of trees a dozen times and seen nothing but bark and shadow. Except Powers isn't looking for a muzzle flash. He's looking for something almost nobody else would think to look for. He grew up hunting deer in the mountains of southwest Virginia, and deer don't give away their position by firing a weapon. They give it away with breath, with the small sounds of movement, with the tiny details that a hurried man never notices and a patient one never misses. So he lies still in snow that's already soaked through his jacket, and he watches the field, waiting for the cold to betray a dying man's last mistake. If stories like this one, real men, real weapons, real history, told the way it actually happened, are what you come here for, now's a good moment to subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. To understand what happens next in that field, you have to go back 3 years, to a boy who never wanted to be famous. Darrell Cecil Powers was born in March of 1923 in the coal country of Clinchco, Virginia, a town so small that everybody in it knew everybody else's business. They called him Shifty, not for anything he did in the war, but for the way he moved on a basketball court as a teenager, quick on his feet, hard to pin down. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life. His father taught him to shoot. Out in those Virginia hills, that wasn't a hobby. It was how a family put meat on the table. By the time Powers was a grown man, he could read wind, read distance, and read an animal's habits well enough to put it down with a single round. He never thought of it as a skill that would one day save other men's lives. He just thought of it as home. Before the war, Powers worked as a machinist in the shipyards of Norfolk alongside a friend named Robert Popeye Wynne. When the government began freezing shipyard workers into their jobs to keep war production running, the two of them saw the writing on the wall. Rather than be tied to a factory floor for the duration, they enlisted together in August of 1942 and volunteered for one of the most dangerous, physically punishing jobs the Army had to offer, the paratroopers. They trained at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, under a company commander named Captain Herbert Sobel, a man Easy Company would spend the rest of their lives having complicated feelings about. Sobel drove his men mercilessly, running them up and down the 3-mile grade of Currahee Mountain again and again, in heat and in mud, until the weak fell away on their own and only the stubborn remained. It was brutal by design. The Army wanted men who wouldn't quit when everything in them was screaming to. Powers was one of the stubborn ones. And when the company's marksmanship scores came in, out of roughly 140 men, Powers was one of only 2 who qualified as an expert marksman on the first attempt. In a company full of men who'd soon be famous for their toughness, Powers became known instead for something quieter, an almost unnatural stillness behind a rifle, and eyes that seemed to catch details other men walked right past. Nobody in Easy Company had an official job title of sniper. Airborne rifle companies in 1944 simply didn't organize that way. Every paratrooper carried the same basic infantry rifle and was expected to fight as a rifleman first. But everybody in the unit knew, without needing to be told twice, that if something needed to be hit at distance, under pressure, with no room for a second shot, you sent for Powers. He jumped into Normandy in the dark, early hours of June 6, 1944, D-Day. Like so many paratroopers that night, his C-47 flew through heavy cloud cover and anti-aircraft fire. and he was scattered miles from his intended drop zone. He spent hours alone in unfamiliar hedgerow country, in the dark, not knowing which farmhouse might hold a German patrol, before he finally found his way back to friendly lines. It was a story shared by hundreds of paratroopers that night, men who jumped as a unit and landed as individuals and had to find their way back to being soldiers again on their own. He rejoined Easy Company in time to fight through the grinding, exhausting battle for the town of Carrington, the first real sustained combat of the war for the men of the 506th. From there, the war carried him into Holland in September of 1944, into the ambitious and ultimately failed airborne gamble known as Operation Market Garden, an attempt to seize a chain of bridges deep into German-held territory and end the war by Christmas. The 101st Airborne fought for weeks along the narrow corridor of road the men grimly nicknamed Hell's Highway, defending it against repeated German counterattacks. The war didn't end by Christmas. Instead, it carried Powers into the coldest, hungriest, most desperate fight of his life, the siege of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne had been rushed into Bastogne in mid-December with almost nothing. No winter coats built for the cold that was coming. No reserve ammunition to speak of. Within days, German forces had encircled the town completely, cutting off resupply. When a German officer approached American lines under a flag of truce and demanded the surrender of the trapped garrison, the acting division commander's one-word answer, "Nuts," became instant legend. But legend didn't keep men warm or fed or supplied with bullets. Around Powers, paratroopers dug into foxholes in frozen ground, fighting frostbite as much as they fought the enemy. Some melted snow for water. Others in the patch of woods known as the Bois Jacques resorted to breaking the ice on a nearby creek, a creek that grimly had a dead American soldier lying in it upstream, and purified what they drank as best they could because there was nothing else. It was in those frozen woods on December 29th that Powers first showed the instincts that would define him. Staring out at the same tree line day after day, he noticed something, a tree that hadn't been there the day before. Not a fallen tree, a tree that had appeared. He mentioned it to his platoon sergeant, Carwood Lipton, almost in passing. Lipton didn't dismiss it. He passed the observation up the chain, and despite Bastogne's desperately short artillery supply, a fire mission was approved. Within the hour, the position, a camouflaged German anti-aircraft battery, was abandoned, its crew driven off by a barrage called in on the word of a hunter who had simply noticed that something in the landscape didn't belong. It's a small story next to what came 2 weeks later, but it tells you exactly what kind of soldier Powers was. He wasn't the loudest man in Easy Company. He rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. What he had instead was patience, and a set of eyes trained over years of Virginia hillsides to notice the one detail that didn't fit. By January 13th, the siege of Bastogne had been broken, and the 101st was going on the offensive, clearing the surrounding villages one by one, pushing the German salient back the way it had come. Foy was next, a small farming town that sat astride open, rolling farmland, with almost no natural cover between the American positions and the buildings the Germans had turned into strongpoints. Easy Company was ordered to swing south of the town and attack north, straight across that open ground in daylight. It was, by any tactical measure, the kind of assignment nobody wanted. A company moving across a snow-covered field with nowhere to hide, in full view of an enemy who'd had days to dig in and range their weapons. The Germans defending Foy knew exactly what that terrain meant for the men coming at them. As Easy Company's lieutenants tried to organize the advance under chaotic, contradictory orders, command of the company had changed hands more than once in recent days, and coordination was breaking down. The men started taking casualties almost immediately, and somewhere in that tree line, one man in particular was doing the damage. A rifleman so well concealed that officers scanning the ground with binoculars couldn't locate him. Man after man went down. The advance stalled cold in the open field. Nobody could return fire at a target nobody could see, and every minute the company stayed pinned in that snow was another minute closer to losing more men than the objective was worth. This is where we return to where we started. Powers lay in the snow, scanning the same stretch of trees, minute after minute, while his friends bled in the open field around him. Every second he spent watching was a second someone else was exposed. He wasn't looking for movement. Movement, in that kind of terrain, was almost impossible to catch. A good rifleman knows how to stay still. He was looking for the one thing a hidden man in freezing weather cannot fully control, no matter how disciplined he is, the small, pale cloud of his own breath, rising and disappearing against the dark tree line. Seconds stretched out. The cold worked its way through wet wool and frozen leather. Somewhere behind him, a wounded man was being dragged back toward what little cover existed. And still Powers watched the same patch of shadow, waiting. And then he saw it. A faint puff, barely there, rising and gone in an instant. The kind of detail that 100 other men could have stared straight at and never noticed. By his own account, given decades later in an interview with his hometown newspaper, he sighted in on that faint puff of condensation, made his adjustment, and fired a single shot. He didn't call it luck. He called it exactly what it was: training, patience, and one clean shot at a target he'd located by the coldest possible clue. Asked, years afterward, exactly where the round had struck, he simply touched his own forehead and said, "Right there, between the eyes." The German rifle fire from that position stopped instantly. Easy Company's advance began moving forward again across the open field. It wasn't until after the fighting for Foy had ended that Sergeant Lipton and Powers' friend Wynne walked out to the tree line to see for themselves what had actually happened. What they found was a single enemy soldier, killed by one round, struck almost dead center in the forehead, exactly where Powers had said. It's worth being honest here, because this channel doesn't deal in exaggeration. This wasn't a mutual back-and-forth gunfight between two snipers who both knew exactly where the other man was standing. It was a hidden marksman pinning down an entire company from cover, and one hunter's patience ending the standoff with a single, first-time shot at a target no one else could even see. Wynne's response afterward, recorded by historian Stephen Ambrose, was blunt, and it became something close to a company legend from that day forward. Nobody in Easy Company, ever again, thought it was a good idea to be on the wrong end of Shifty's rifle. Foy was cleared before the day was out. The line held, and Powers once again walked away from combat without so much as a scratch, a streak that, by that point in the war, had already outlasted the luck of most of the men he'd trained with back at Taco. That fact deserves its own moment, because it's almost as remarkable as the shot itself. From Normandy, through Holland, through the frozen hell of Bastogne, and now through Foy, Darrell Powers survived nearly a full year of continuous frontline combat with the most decorated parachute infantry regiment in the United States Army, and he never once took an enemy round. Of all the men in Easy Company, he was one of the very few who could say that. The war, it turned out, wasn't finished testing him. Sometime after VE Day, while waiting to be shipped home, Powers was riding in a truck with other soldiers when a drunk driver slammed into the vehicle. One man was killed. Powers survived, but with a shattered pelvis and injuries severe enough to keep him hospitalized for nearly a year, hurt worse, in the end, by a careless accident on a peacetime road than by anything the German army had thrown at him. He came home to Virginia. He married a woman named Dorothy, a marriage that lasted 60 years until his death. He took a job as a machinist for a coal company and worked there for more than 2 decades, raising a family in the same hill country where he'd learned to shoot as a boy. And for most of that time, he simply didn't talk about the war. Not because he was ashamed of it, because, like so many men of his generation, he didn't see the point in dwelling on it. His own family has said he almost never brought it up on his own. That the man his neighbors knew was a quiet, gentle machinist, not a war hero, and that as far as he was concerned, those two things had nothing to do with each other. That silence lasted until 1992, when historian Stephen Ambrose published a book called Band of Brothers, and later in 2001, when it became one of the most acclaimed war miniseries ever made for television. Suddenly, a private, humble machinist from Dickinson County, Virginia, was receiving fan mail from strangers around the world, people who'd never met him, writing to say thank you for something he'd never once brought up at his own dinner table. Here's the part of the story that a lot of people don't know. Powers was barely in it. Of all the men whose stories filled that 10-part series, his combat actions, the tree line, the anti-aircraft battery, the shot at Foy, were left almost entirely off screen. He appears mostly as himself, an old man in an interview chair between episodes, reflecting quietly on friends who never came home. The most extraordinary marksman in Easy Company became on film one of its quietest presences. Fans who read Ambrose's book and later learned the full story have spent years arguing that Shifty Powers deserved far more screen time than he ever received. And it's hard, once you know what actually happened in that snow-covered field, to disagree. Those same years brought Powers something he'd never expected, a kind of fame that arrived 70 years too late to matter to a 21-year-old machinist's mate. But that clearly meant something to the old man he'd become. He gave interviews, he signed books, he spoke, when asked, with the same plain, unadorned honesty he'd carried since Virginia. And in 2009, shortly before his death, he sat for a series of new interviews that would become part of a book called We Who Are Alive and Remain, making sure that his account of Foy and of the friends he'd lost would exist in his own words, and not just in someone else's retelling. Powers passed away on June 17, 2009, at the age of 86, after a battle with lung cancer. There was no national headline, no 24-hour news coverage. In the small towns of Southwest Virginia, where he'd spent nearly his entire life, he was buried the way he'd lived, quietly, among family, without ever once having asked for the recognition that eventually found him anyway. Fellow veterans who'd shared a foxhole with him in the Ardennes remembered a man who never once brought up the war unless someone else asked first, and who seemed genuinely surprised, deep into his 80s, that strangers still wanted to hear about it. What Darrell Powers leaves behind isn't a story about killing, it's a story about attention, about a man who spent his whole life learning to notice what everyone else missed, first in the woods of Virginia, then in the woods of Belgium, and who, when it mattered most, used that patience to save the lives of the men lying beside him in the snow. He didn't have the loudest voice in Easy Company. He didn't need one. What he had was a steadiness that never left him, from Currahee Mountain to a frozen field outside Foy, and a set of eyes that the United States Army was lucky enough to put a rifle behind. He never called himself a hero. His daughter said he never once bragged about what he'd done, not even to his own family, not even after the world found out. But on a freezing January morning in a Belgian field, while better armed men searched a tree line for a target they couldn't see, one quiet Virginia hunter simply watched the cold, and it told him everything he needed to know. The men who walked away from Foy that day owed their lives to a skill nobody had taught him for war. He'd learned it as a boy, tracking deer through the hills of home, never once imagining it would one day be the reason other men's families got to see their sons come home too. If you want more stories like this one, verified, respectful, and told with the weight they deserve, subscribe, hit the bell, and let this channel keep bringing these men's names back into the light where they belong. Their stories don't survive on their own. They survive because someone keeps telling them.